So I want to say a word about our group for those of you who may be joining us for the first time. Force Multiplier is an all-volunteer organization that raises funds for Democratic candidates in key races for the House and Senate and for grassroots groups that ensure that people can and do vote. Our community of over 10,000 has raised $15 million since its founding 6 years ago, $5 million of it in the midterm cycle. So thanks to all who contributed to that fantastic result. So we were thrilled to be part of a successful national effort that held the Senate and minimized losses in the House in what was supposed to be a red wave election. At the same time, we were sobered to see the radical transformation the House has undergone with the loss of just 9 Democratic seats. It's clear that the MAGA faction of the Republican Party remains a threat to our democracy, and it's clear that the Republican Party lacks the courage and integrity to stand up to them. We're now confronted by a House that is likely to shut down the government, risk a national default, attack abortion access, and defund the IRS. We really need to take back the House. So on to tonight's program. From the beginning of the midterm cycle, there was a consensus that seemed to evolve that it would be difficult for Democrats to win. We were told that midterm history, presidential approval ratings, and the economy would be decisive and that the Democrats would lose their majorities in both the House and Senate. Overcoming this pessimistic red wave narrative became our first order of business. Tonight's speakers, Tom Bonier and Simon Rosenberg, were enormously helpful to us in doing this. They challenged the prevailing views of the midterms, restored our hope, and renewed our energy. Politico called Simon Rosenberg the article of Democratic midterm optimism. He's a former Clinton staffer and was a top advisor to the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. In his current capacity as president of the New Democrat Network, Rosenberg advises leading politicians, administration officials, and policymakers on a wide range of issues, and he's a frequent commentator in the national media. Tom Bonier is a pioneer in the introduction of big data into the progressive political space and currently serves as CEO of TargetSmart. He consulted for the campaigns of Senators Booker, Warren, and Hester, among others, as well as on President Obama's 2008 campaign. And he's appeared many times in the New York Times, Washington Post, and on PBS NewsHour. Tom and Simon will have a conversation about their work, followed by a Q&A moderated by Dale Smith, co-chair of Force Multiplier's Political Research Committee. And I should point out that Simon has had travel delays today and is going to be initially on a phone from his cab, and then will join us from his home when he gets there. So Simon and Tom, thank you for your work, for your data-informed optimism, and for joining us tonight. The floor is yours.
Listen, thank you, everybody, and thank you for your incredible work over these last 5 years, I guess, that it is. Very inspiring. I think that one of the great things that Tom and I was so rewarding about what we did was the kind of sessions with groups like this all over the country. I mean, what's amazing is there are many of these self-organized volunteer organizations that have become a big force in our politics, and it's really been wonderful to be with groups like this and with all of you the last couple of years. So let me tell you, we're going to just go through a little bit about the story of how we came to fight the red wave. That will take about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions all the way till 8, as long as you guys want to go. And this story began in October of 2021, when Joe Biden's approval rating had now come down quite a bit, about 20 points from its height in late May. And I noticed that even though his approval rating had come down, the congressional generic, that question about, are you going to vote Democrat or Republican for Congress, which traditionally tracks the approval rating of the president pretty closely, actually didn't move at all. And I wondered, whether or not, what I postulated in a piece that I wrote on November 1st, 2021, was that, was there a MAGA hangover? We had two consecutive elections, a huge turnout, a majority of the country had voted against MAGA. the Republicans had made what I thought was a huge strategic error if they wanted to win, which they ran towards a politics that had just been rejected by the country in overwhelming numbers twice. And then what I wondered is whether, somebody could be disappointed in Biden, but have no intention of voting Republican. And then I also, in the same article, wrote that I felt that Democrats would have a lot to run on in the election in 2022, and that the amazing amounts of money that our candidates were raising, thanks to groups like this, was allowing us to build bigger campaigns, and it would mitigate the midterm drop off, and that we would be able to sort of not have what happened in 2010 and 2014 happen in this election cycle. And that's sort of what happened in the election. I mean, you could see the contours of this, even a year out. But then what really mattered was that on May 2nd, the Dobbs decision got leaked. And I think that's when the possibility of a good election for us, started to become a reality. That's when the election that we saw in November started to really form. And I was part of a group called Future Majority that did polling in Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania in mid-May of Hispanic voters. And we found Democrats overperforming expectations and Republicans underperforming expectations in that polling. And so I started looking around at other public polls. And what happened in this cycle, and part of the reason I think so many people got it wrong, was that there was less polling than usual because there were so many late primaries. Republicans had so many contentious primaries. So in the battleground states, there just wasn't the normal amount of polling that you normally have. But the polling that we did have in May and early and mid-June showed Democrats overperforming and Republicans underperforming. And I wrote a piece in mid-June saying, there's no red wave. And I started challenging that red wave narrative in that period, talking to reporters, got a few stories, and then Dobbs happened. And then that election that we hoped was going to be a good election became a good election for the Democrats. And there was really one election from that point on. On the 28th of June, just 4 days after Dobbs, we overperformed in a special election in Nebraska, House special by 10 points. In the House specials that happened in Alaska, Minnesota, New York, in addition to Nebraska, we overperformed on average our 2020 numbers by 7 points. If it was a red wave year, we would be underperforming consistently in all those places, and we were overperforming. And so that was very good news. And the June 30th fundraising filing that we had in the incumbent races in the House, we had 5 6-to-1 cash on hand advantages over the Republicans. In their incumbent races, they only had a 2-to-1 cash on hand advantage. Our candidates in the House and Senate races in the final 5 months had much more money than the Republicans did. And then Kansas happened. And let me turn it to Tom.
Thank you, Simon. And thank you, everyone. It's really great to be here. Let me say, I really appreciate the work that Force Multiplier has done this cycle and previous cycles. So it's super exciting to be with this group. Deeply appreciative of the work you've done in our space. I will say, as a quick caveat, I am speaking to y'all. Simon and I are seemingly always on the run. I am in my classroom at Howard University. Today was the first day of classes. I taught my first class of the semester. So I'm hoping that no one walks into the classroom for another class, but we seem to be fine here. So picking up where Simon left off and talking about Kansas, I think we're all well aware of what happened in Kansas, the striking 18-point victory for the pro-choice no vote. What I think the meaningful component of that was, to that point, as Simon laid out, the general public discourse, when we look at the media, primarily, but to some extent operatives on both sides, was this notion of an inevitable red wave. And we've all lived through red waves. We know what they look like, not just from a sort of touch and feel perspective, but from a data-driven perspective. 2010 and 2014, the last 2 midterm elections with a Democratic president in the White House, we could look at that data and we could see in those elections, the way red waves happen, it's no mystery. You see low Democratic enthusiasm and you see independents flocking to Republicans. That's what a red wave looks like. And in this Dobbs election, what we saw was in a early or midsummer primary election in a red state, a pro-choice victory by a shocking 18-point margin that was driven by women registering to vote at unprecedented rates. 70% of new registrants in Kansas leading up to that election were women, which is something I've never seen before, and I don't expect to see again. And when you look at who voted in that Kansas election, it was women, and it was overwhelmingly younger women. Now, of course, there's the caveat that that was a vote that was literally on a constitutional amendment on choice, but it showed very clearly that the Dobbs decision, as Simon said, changed the landscape of the electorate. And to the extent that this election would be, to some extent, about choice, but also more broadly about Republican extremism, in a way that I think the Dobbs decision consolidated that argument that wasn't resonating before. January 6th wasn't exactly landing. You were seeing these extreme Republican candidates like Dr. Oz, Kelly Ward, and Herschel Walker, and Dobbs changed that. And so what we did after Kansas is we started looking at the voter registration data to see, were we seeing signs of renewed Democratic intensity and enthusiasm, or were Republicans still having some sort of advantage there? And the answer was there were gender gaps in every state but 3 that were bigger after Dobbs than they were before, and that Democrats, especially in these battlegrounds, were registering at a higher rate. The next level of analysis for us was the early vote. And so our team at Target Smart, and I have to give them credit, we have a wonderful team at Target Smart that worked tirelessly, and they put together this site. Some of you may have seen it, Target Early. If you go to targetearly.com, you can check it out. It's still there. But what we decided to do was to take the early vote. We knew that the early vote would be a critical component of this election. We anticipated that it would be a significant portion of the electorate who would vote before Election Day. And from an analytical standpoint, it gave us the opportunity to look, and it was another checkpoint to see, are we seeing something that looks like a red wave? And a red wave in the early vote would show Democrats underperforming turnout in previous cycles in the early vote. And so what we did is we put the site out that took all the data. Twice a day would be updated with who voted, the data on who actually cast the ballot. And we made it public for everyone to look at. Simon, to his great credit, among his many incredible contributions this cycle to pushing back on this narrative, frankly, exponentially more so than anyone did this cycle, Simon went out and he was the biggest consumer of that website. And he was looking through that early vote data, and he was sharing, for those of you, and I have to imagine you all already follow Simon on Twitter, but if you don't, you should. Every morning he was putting out an analysis of that early vote using the data that we were putting out on Target Early, and putting this in the context of previous elections and saying, look, Democratic turnout in these key states is actually exceeding the previous benchmarks. And we were seeing this steady drumbeat, and Simon and I would be in constant contact around this, where not only were Democrats exceeding the previous election turnout, it was getting better every day, slightly better. It was at first just kind of staying the same, which was good, because if a red wave was coming, you would see Republicans actually beginning to do better, and we weren't seeing that. And then it actually got better and younger, which then led us into really the last couple of weeks of the election, where I'm going to throw it back to Simon, because I think that was really a critical moment in sort of this red wave narrative that consolidated the swing back to the notion of the inevitable red wave. So I'll give it back to Simon.
So what happened over the summer was that we were able to get most of the media to back off the red wave. And there was an article in Politico saying that I was risking reputational harm by my aggressive challenging of the red wave. But by basically by the end of September, there was a general belief that the election was going to be more competitive than people believed, and that Dobbs had really changed everything, and that there was a lot of intensity around Dobbs and women, and that women were, giving money and showing up, and that there was intensity on the Democratic side. And as Tom says, what we had seen at that point, I'm going to now use Tom's framework, is that we kept seeing the reason we were so certain that things were going to be close and competitive and not a red wave was that our voters were checking, our side was checking all the intensity boxes. Hold on one second, everybody. Sir, you're going to take this first left here and go up 2 blocks. Yeah, this is real time in a taxi from Dulles Airport. It was a crazy day, as all of you know. Flying was not fun today. So so what we saw was intensity in the House specials. We saw intensity in the voter reg. We saw intensity in Kansas. We saw intensity in the fundraising, right? And so everywhere you looked, we saw Democratic intensity and overperformance and Republican underperformance. And so we were waiting for the early vote to see if this would show up, the election itself, would all these trends that we saw, would it actually show up in the election? And then what happened was there was a New York Times poll that showed the election moving 4 points to the Republicans. And then this illicit set of polls began around the same time, where the Republicans in 7 states dropped over 40 polls by 10 different pollsters. It was clearly an illicit campaign to game the hold on a second, everybody. Go one more block, sir, and then take a right to game the polling averages. And what happened is that the pressure of the Republicans screaming red wave, red wave, red wave. Also, some people on our side who had predicted a Democratic wipeout saying red wave, red wave, red wave, created this sort of peer pressure again, and the red wave turned. The red wave as a national narrative. And we said, we don't think it is a red wave. We think it's going to be a close competitive election. And then the early vote data came, and the early vote showed, hold on, just right here, sir, is good. Just here, this is good right here. The early vote showed, as Tom said, incredible intensity for us. And so we went back into challenging the red wave narrative again. And as some of you who follow this work that we did closely, saw, was that the red wave, we were attacked by Nate Silver, we were attacked by the Cook Report, we were attacked by some people you see on TV all the time, whose names I won't say, in both public and private settings. And so we went into the final week actually feeling like, hey, we were going to do okay. The early vote was terrific. And what changed in the national narrative, in the media narrative, was this illicit set of fake polls that I actually got home, everybody. It's very exciting. Is this illicit set of fake polls, which caused the media to declare a red wave. And on the night before the election, in the analysis, my final analysis that I published, I said, I think we're going to be at 51 in the Senate, and I got the Senate correctly. And I said that, the House was going to be very competitive, and that, we were going to do better than everybody expected. And what happened was in this election is that in 2020, we had a data problem. In this election, we had an analysis problem, and that people, the analysts, fell for the red wave. They fell for the peer pressure. They fell for the herd journalism. They fell for all of that. And thank God we were right? Because we not only increased our margin in the Senate, the House was very competitive, and basically was so competitive it could have gone either way, a few thousand votes here or there. We picked up governor's races. We picked up state legislative districts, and we picked up, what was the other story? A good story, but it was overall a good election. And our basic, and I'm going to make this one final point and turn it back to Tom, and we'll start getting to Q&A, is that part of what happened in the election was there were two elections. There was a bluer election inside the battleground, and there was a redder election outside the battleground. As somebody had noted in the notes, we didn't do well in New York and California outside the battleground. And what we showed is with our big campaigns and all the money that you helped raise, we were able to control the information environment in the battleground, have our very robust and huge campaigns apparatus, push turnout in ways that we never could before because of the size of our campaigns. And we actually outperformed 2020 in 7 of the most important battleground states, in Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and New Hampshire, right? It was incredible. Incredible performance. And all of us should be so proud, because despite all the crap raining down on our heads and everyone telling us we didn't have a shot, we, the Democratic Party, the people of the Democratic Party, the grassroots, we weren't going to have that. And something that was said at the very beginning, I want you to know that this work that Tom and I were doing, I got 100 million Twitter views on my Twitter feed from mid-October to early November. And it was because so many people like you just wanted to believe that these crazy people weren't going to take over the country. And we didn't give up. We were resilient and strong. We believed in ourselves and in our party. And I think Democratic Party today is as strong as it's been in, in the 30 years that I've been doing this. So thank you guys. I mean, a big part of this story is groups like you not giving up and fighting all the way to the end and giving us the resources, the volunteer resources to do the work on the ground, the money that the candidates needed to communicate and build these large campaigns. And we go into 2023, much stronger than the Republicans. And I still, as I kept saying during the campaign, I'd much rather be us than them. I mean, that was the line Tom and I used again and again and again. We would much rather be us than them heading into 2023 and 2024. I mean that morally, but I also mean that politically, right? I mean, I think that we are a stronger party than they are, and that we have the advantage going into the presidential election in 2024. So let me stop there. I'm going to run to my computer and excited for the discussion, everybody.
Yeah, so I think we're ready for questions. If Dale, if you want to
Sure. Well,
jump in.
Since Simon's not here, I will actually aim this question at you on the polling and the.
Dale, you got muted halfway into that.
Okay,
after you said the word polling, your computer shut you down.
My question for you is polling dead? How could the polls be better? Can you talk about exactly how the Republicans manipulated the polls and how we can prevent it in the future? I mean, I remember seeing that they had, I don't know, was it Phillips Academy or something as one of the polls that they listed?
From my hometown.
I looked them up and I was like, that's high school students. Like, what are you talking about? So can you just talk a little bit about that, as you were one of the people who brought that to everyone's attention?
Yeah, I would love to. And when Simon gets back on, I'm going to leave the polling averages component. He alluded to this, but I think this is an important component of the story. And Simon was such a leader on this element of really calling out, of him going on national TV and calling out 538 Real Clear Politics for how the poll averages were gamed. And Simon alluded to that, but let me talk a little bit about sort of the question of is polling dead? My answer is no. Polling is damaged. In the end, campaigns and the media, they're not going to walk away from polls. It won't happen. What will happen, and when you look at the polling, in general, the high quality polls, the media polls, were actually quite good. They did have something different this time around that we hadn't experienced, which was they generally had a pro-Republican bias. And I think to Simon's point, he said, in 2020, we had a data problem, and in 2022, we had an analytical problem. That's a big component of it, is people were taking these polls, they were giving too much credibility to these Republican polls. The Phillips Academy kids weren't the only high school pollsters that had polls included in the 538 average. There were two kids from Philadelphia as well, who were high school juniors, who had polls that were included in the 538 average, which is perhaps a bit of a failure of 538's part in terms of the role of as gatekeepers. But in the end, the media polls were pretty good. But in generally, people were taking them. The media, Democratic strategists, Republican strategists were taking those polls, and then they were putting their finger on the scale from an analytical perspective and saying, well, we know the polls generally have had a Democratic bias. So if this poll shows us down a point in Wisconsin, what it really means is we're losing Wisconsin by a lot. And we saw that. That was an analytical failure. In the end, polling is getting more challenging. I don't want to be Pollyanna about this. Response rates are dropping dramatically to the point where if you get just over 1% of the people you call taking the survey, you're lucky. That's a problem. There is response bias, but I want to give credit. There are good pollsters there. And Simon and I had the pleasure of working with a group, including some very good pollsters that gave us a level of confidence that what we were seeing was accurate. The last point I'll make, and I'll hand it over to Simon, who I believe is back now, is we just have to be smarter about how we consume polls, not just separating the red wave polls from the media polls, but understanding that every poll is a snapshot of potential turnout. And so what we were doing and why we felt confident in our analysis is we were looking at their likely voter models. So after the Senate debate in Pennsylvania, There was a poll that came out 3 days later that showed Fetterman losing. It was the first poll that showed him losing, including the 538 average. And that fed a media frenzy to say, well, he blew it in the debate, he's losing. We looked at that poll and saw it was a poll that was conducted over 2 hours in a single night, which is a big no-no in polling. And it had only half as many respondents under the age of 30 who have ever turned out in a Pennsylvania election, meaning they've never been less than 28% of the electorate in the last several cycles in Pennsylvania. They were only 14% of respondents. And so we looked at that, and I see Simon's rejoining right now. We looked at that poll and we said, look, we have a level of confidence that these polls aren't depicting reality. And that's the sort of analysis that we will need to do going forward. I see Simon rejoined. Okay, and he's been given co-host duties. Simon, yeah, Simon, if I can hand it to you. So the question was about, is polling dead? If you could just talk about the polling average component, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. Let me just. Can you hear me, everybody? Am I back?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. It's a busy day. So yeah, look, the short answer, because I think Tom covered a lot of it. The national media polls were actually really good, and most of them got it right, and which is amazing. What happened was, though, that there was an effort, a concerted effort by who we don't know whom, by some group of Republicans to sway the polling averages, and Real Clear Politics, played an active role in it and should never be considered to be a serious source of data ever again after what they did this cycle. But more disturbingly, Nate Silver in 538, basically never acknowledged that this was happening. It took me going on Joy Reid's show on October 31st, and I directly called out 538 on the air. Nate Silver, then attacked me unbelievably a few days later in his podcast. And we created a real storm on October 31st by challenging all the media analysts, all the people you watch on TV, that there was clearly this thing coming. And Dave Wasserman in the Cook Report described our analysis as astrology. Nate Silver said I was smoking hopium, right? Which is, I'm now put in my bio that I'm a hopium purveyor, and I'm enjoying that and embracing that as a nickname. But it is, what was disappointing and what we have to be worried about is not the data. It was that very highly paid, sophisticated analysts kept rejecting all the data that Tom and I were throwing at them over month after month after month after month. And because of the power of the right-wing noise machine, because of herd journalism, because of just the nature of our system, the Democratic Party itself wasn't really helping us, to be honest. I mean, Jamie Harrison was tweeting our stuff out, but I think a lot of people in the party thought Tom and I had kind of gone crazy and were not willing to sort of jump with us, out into, and we know this for a fact, actually, in talking to people afterwards, that there were Democratic operatives in significant places of authority saying, we're not sure that they're right, we don't want to follow them where they're going. And what I just want to say that I think that the big learning for me in this cycle, and we've gone on a long time, and we'll give you shorter answers from here on out, is that something happened to us this cycle that I don't think I had ever experienced in my 30 years doing this, which is that we lost confidence in ourselves. We got angry at each other. I think it happened during the BBB fight in the fall of 2021. And there was just this just negativity and just, disappointment and anger and frustration. And we just don't have the luxury of that. I mean, we're up against real bad guys here, right? And, we got to eat it, suck it up. We got to, sell our stuff. Joe Biden's been a good president. We're a really good party. They're a little too crazy. And we've got to make sure that that thing that happened to us over the last 18 months where we got really down on ourselves. And I always say that, look, remember Democrats, there's no reason to criticize each other because there's an entire political party that does that really effectively every day. We don't have to make these attacks against ourselves. We need to use the limited time we have in communicating to the public to talk about the good things that we've done. And you know what? It's immense. We've been doing a lot of really good things for a long time. And we have to get better at seeing the glass half full than half empty as a family. And I joke sometimes, and I'm speaking very honestly here, that I felt sometimes like I was the shrink for the Democratic Party in the election, saying, no, we're good enough, we're strong enough, we can do this. But it is critical that we never allow that kind of negativity and disappointment in ourselves seep back into our politics, particularly while MAGA remains such an extraordinary and present threat to the Republic.
Thank you guys so much. This was fascinating, like always. Simon, I hope you had a chance to get a drink of water and take a breath and say hi to your family.
My dog wanted to play, but he's going to have to wait a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. I hope he doesn't have to go out. But anyway, so there's been a ton of questions in the chat, and I have some questions. I'm going to try to, put some of them together. I think one of the questions, you alluded to this, that this was 2 elections that, we did really pretty well in the battleground states. And then if we hadn't lost seats in New York and California, in blue states, in Biden won districts, we might have been able to hold on to the House by a seat or 2. Yep. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of how that happened and what we can do differently?
Let me start, and then Tom, I want Tom to pick up, is that, look, there's a good news, bad news story here, right? The good news is that where we ran real campaigns and we focused, we raised the money, we built, think about this, right? I mean, I've been doing this for over 30 years. I worked on the Dukakis presidential campaign when I was a very young guy. And we've never had campaigns as big as they are now, right? Our campaigns, our House and Senate campaigns have 2 to 3 times the money that they had even 10 years ago. And what that extra money is doing is it's allowing us to target lower propensity voters and move down the target list of GOTV. Any of you who've done field or done door knocking and canvassing, that there's a prioritization. And the prioritization in the past was based on scarcity, right? We only had so many volunteers, so much money, there's only so many people we can reach. We're now in a politics of abundance in the Democratic Party. We have a lot of money. We have the biggest campaigns that we've ever had. And what's happening is that something's kicking in that I call the virtuous cycle of participation. And it's what happened during the early vote. One of the things that comes out of this election is that if you're a good Democrat, you have to vote on day 1 or day 2. If you vote early, then what happens is the campaign gets to move on to lower propensity voters, and it increases turnout. And what Tom and I were saying through the whole late summer and fall was that that this virtuous cycle of participation could kick in for us because we were seeing it happen earlier. And so I think there has been a much more profound change in our campaigns and the way that we run our campaigns than is commonly understood based on the money that we have in this virtuous cycle of participation. But so where we had that, we not only did well, we actually exceeded 2020, right? It's incredible given high inflation, Biden's low approval rating, the right-wing noise machine, the media basically being in the tank for the Republicans for the last 6 months. We did really well. But where we didn't have those campaigns, right, they did well in New York and California and Florida and Texas. And so one of the things that you shouldn't get spooked by are these national numbers. There was not one election. Any analysis that you read that's about, there's one election, Democrats did this, Republicans did this, it's inaccurate because it doesn't get to the nature of what happened, which is there were 2 elections. So the bad news is that we have to get better at controlling the national media narrative every day. I'm quoting the Washington Post in a Greg Sargent column about this today, in that we have to become much more intentional and purposeful. I was a war room guy in '92, right? We got to win the information battle every day. And I don't think we think that way. They do, right? We have to get better at that. And when Tom and I went in and briefed the White House, right, we had a long conversation about this, about how, we all collectively have to get better at winning the national battle, the information battle every day, so that we don't have to be so reliant on these massive campaigns. We've got to be able to do both, right? We've got to be able to build these huge, new, sophisticated, wonderful campaigns that we have, and we've got to win the national information war every day. If we can do both of those things, we're going to have a very good 2024 election. Tom.
Yeah, just real quick, because I can't improve upon anything Simon said, but I think to reinforce that one point about the issue environment, Mike Podhorzer, who many of you probably know, he said this in a post-election panel we did together that struck me as insightful just in its simplicity. He said, people vote based on what they believe to be true. And I think that really tells the story of this election. In these states where it did look more like a red wave, in New York, especially around New York City and Nassau County, and on Staten Island, you think about what people believe to be true. The Democratic argument on extremism, reinforced by Dobbs. I met with organizers from SEIU 1199, based in New York, but around the country. But I talked to their New York director after the election, and they told a story about how they were going around and telling people that, if we elect Zeldin governor, women are going to lose the right to choose. And voters would just laugh at them. They'd say, that's not going to happen in New York. And if it does happen, we'll just vote him out. And so to Simon's point, we need to be more deliberate and intentional. We need to control the national issue environment, and we need to control it in these places where we underperform. And the good news is, from this election, the path is there. We've seen that what we do works. We just need to be able to do it, more of it, be more intentional about it, to Simon's point, and start now.
So one of the things that you've mentioned a number of times is the media, and the media having it seemed a red bias. And how are we going to change that going forward, or how did that happen? And what can change going forward to make them at least be fair?
We have to hit them harder. This is in part our fault, right? It's part of the reason why what Tom and I did. I was a TV producer for ABC News. I started the media business before I went into politics, and I grew up in the media business. They respond to pressure. They respond to people talking to them. They respond to the virtue of arguments. They're in the game with you, right? And part of the reason we were so successful is that I called every reporter I'd ever met in my entire life, and I worked them really hard. And there's a story that Tom talked about that Blake Hansel, this reporter for the New York Times who passed away yesterday, who wrote about our work during the election. There was a weekend where he and I he reached out to me in like a Friday morning about the election, red wavy kind of stuff. And I told him he was wrong. And 25 emails and texts later, 48 hours later, he basically capitulated, right? But he and I, spent an entire weekend having a fight, basically, a discussion is perhaps a better term. And I was able to move him, but it took, and I was doing 2 to 3 hours of press a day, cajoling reporters and pushing on them. And it's just, you got to be in the game. If you're going to fight, you got to go fight, right? I mean, I'm a war room guy. I believe that we are in an information war, and they're ahead of us on this. We're better in campaigns. They're ahead of us in the national information war. And one of the questions that was kicking around in the chat, I'll just throw out there, is that whoever asked this, we are underperforming on economic issues. And this is the other thing that we really, if I could leave, this whole meeting with 2 sort of big takeaways. One is that we have to become much more intentional about putting positive sentiment into our discourse. I think part of the strategy of Greater MAGA is to put negative sentiment into our discourse, to make us feel bad about ourselves, about our country, about our institutions, our leaders, each other. And we need to defeat MAGA. We have to create more positive sentiment in our daily discourse. And this is really important. And I'm going to be writing and talking about this a lot more. And I've really come to believe this very deeply based on my own hopium journey over the last 6 months. But the second thing is we have to do better in the economy. And I have a presentation called With Democrats, Things Get Better. I hope all of you can come watch it. It goes through economic data over the last 30 years. And I'll just give you one statistic. Since 1989, Democrats have been in the White House for 18 years. Republicans have been in the White House for 16 years. There have been 47 million jobs created. 45 million of those have been created under Democratic presidents, 96%. We shouldn't be losing the economic argument to a party that's brought 3 consecutive recessions, 3 spiraling deficits, when we've brought growth and progress in our 3 presidents. And we have to also get much more intentional about winning the economic battle, information war. And my final point I'll make, and I'll turn to Tom, because I just want to get this out there before people leave, is that you all need to become information warriors. I mean, not just the work that you do here, which is really important, and canvassing, giving money, all these things, but think about yourself as somebody who's putting positive sentiment and good data out into the discourse every day. We need to think of the war room not as 20 kids in headquarters, but 4 million patriots every day fighting the red wave, fighting the inflation's going to kill us, fighting all their memes and narratives. All of you have agency in this. You're not powerless. We can change the media. Tom and I just did it ourselves, 2 private citizens, just 2 guys, right? Went out and changed, challenged this national media narrative. Imagine if 4 million of us every day are active information warriors. We can be louder than the right-wing noise machine. And so I just want to also say to all of you is that I think we have more power than we know, and we have to start using it more than we do. And I think because we have a better argument, we're a better party, we've done better for the American people, and we can prevail in the coming battles that are so important.
So do you guys think that the leadership of the Democratic Party and their communication and policy groups get this? I mean, do you feel, are they listening to you and others like you? Is there, I think a lot of people feel their messaging wasn't great last cycle. Do you see any hope for them understanding what you're saying?
Tom, you want to take that, or you want me to take that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a hand grenade, but look,
That's why we handed it to you.
It's an important, it's an important question. I'm not a communications expert or professional. I've been roped into this from a data perspective, because I will say, and I'm not avoiding your question, but I want to add something I think is relevant to this and add to what Simon said. 2 quick things. I said that voters vote on what they believe to be true. Well, reporters report on what they believe to be true. And it's why this is all connected. When Simon talks about being louder, be more deliberate, and everyone, the rank and file, being louder and being information warriors, that's what's important, because reporters were not, it wasn't just 538 and Real Clear Politics, though that was incredibly important and impactful, and we need to litigate that. And frankly, Simon has done more than anyone to push on that, which is a huge service. But it's also Democratic operatives and strategists not going on cable news and talking about Democrats losing, which we saw, right? And it's about all of us being more deliberate and more positive. If reporters, the way it drives, and someone asked this question in the chat, did the red wave narrative actually help us because it inspired people to get out? Maybe. We're all motivated in different ways. I think what Simon and I experienced was a lot of people, when we would share hard data that showed that this was going to be a close and competitive election, we would hear from people saying, thank you so much for this. I was so demoralized and depressed. I couldn't do anything. I was checked out. I saw this and I went out and I signed up for a shift, for texting, for phone calls, for canvassing, for whatever. Everyone's different, but I do think positivity and optimism is important. But from a press perspective, people in Wisconsin were waking up every day to stories about crime and inflation because they believed, based on this false red wave narrative, that Mandela Barnes was blowing it. He lost by 25,000 votes. That narrative hurt him, undoubtedly. And so these are the lessons we can learn. Back to the question about the party. They have an excellent team there. They're also in a difficult position. I do think in general, the party, and this is not pointing fingers at the DNC or any specific operation, but they're humans who lived through 2020 and 2016. And I think they were scared of losing, and they were a little bit demoralized. And a lot of people were eventually believing the stuff about the red wave, and I think it made it harder for them. And I think they've learned that lesson.
Yeah, I also think, listen, we have to be very encouraged. I think some of this is generational, a little bit of this is generational. And, if you see how savvy Hakeem Jeffries has been just in his early days, I will tell you that, I have been watching these House Democrats. I'm very close to the House, a little bit more so than the Senate. They are fired up and ready to go. I mean, their speeches on the floor, their appearances on television, their Twitter feeds are on fire. I think that we did learn collectively this cycle that we have to fight harder against them. And I think the House Democrats are ready for what's about to happen. They're not unprepared. They're ready. And rhetorically and in sort of information warrior, sense, they're ready. But I think this is something sometimes we think this is stuff we do in campaigns, as opposed to something we have to do 24/7, 365. And there needs to be a cultural more of a. I want to be really clear. I don't think this is something that's a problem or bad. It's just we have to get better, right? And the good news is our campaigns kick their campaigns ass. And we're at least 1 election cycle, 2 election cycles ahead of them structurally in campaigns now. That was not true before, right? That's a big new tactical advantage we have, right? We now have lots of voters in the battleground states who voted against MAGA as being too wild and crazy, 3 consecutive elections. It's going to be very hard for them to then turn around and look at somebody like DeSantis, who's just as MAGA as Trump, and think that this guy is not MAGA. They know MAGA. They voted against MAGA. They've been living MAGA. They had these candidates. They're not into MAGA. They're not going to be into DeSantis. That's why I'm not scared of him. I think we can take him, right? I mean, he's going to be tough, but we can take him. Whether Biden runs for re-election, which I think if he does, he'll be unopposed. And if he doesn't, I think we'll have a vigorous and wonderful Democratic primary that will showcase a lot of next generation leaders that I think we'll all be very proud of. And so I think either way we win. And that's why I think the message I wrote, my post-election memo, which I'll put into the chat here in a second, is the Democratic Party is strong. They're weak, right? We're united. They're divided. We've governed well. They're crazy, right? And when you think about the way we were thinking about things 6 months ago, we suck, they're strong. It's the actual opposite of all that, right? We're strong. They're weak. We're united. They're divided. We have to change the way that we look at the world and be more open to the idea that we're actually forces for good, that we're achieving important things, that we're strong politically, that we have good leaders, that we raise lots of money. And they're really all sorts of MAGA and all sorts of crazy. And that's why I would rather be us than them.
Okay. So selfishly,
Yes.
we have so many questions, and I won't be able to get to all of them, which is horrible. Although I do want to refer people to the chat where there are a lot of links, including the link to NDN's website, where Simon's videos are on there. And I really recommend the With Democrats Things Are Better video. It's fantastic. You'll love it. And then we also have Tom Bonier's website link on Target Smart and Target Early, that if somebody can put up. So that's just one thing. But so selfishly, from Force Multiplier's point of view, what we would love help on, maybe we can get this from you, is about the leading indicators for the 2024 cycle. I mean, we as a group try to pick candidates that are in competitive races. We do House and Senate in any state. Most of us are from blue states. We look in all the other states. We look at groups. We look at voter empowerment groups. We choose states with which to invest our money with a partnership with America Votes doing that. And we look at all the data we can. We look at the 22 margins. We look at the rankings. We look at fundraising. We look at local newspapers. But, what do you look at that, would help us? What should we be looking at now that maybe we didn't know about before, that you know about, that'll help us do a better job as we represent our community and give them advice on how to invest in democracy?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways from this cycle, it was Simon talked about checking the boxes and the data we were looking at. That data is incredibly valuable because the polls are not going away. To your first question, they're still valuable in determining sort of broad parameters of potential viability and competitiveness. But to look at potential intensity and enthusiasm and engagement, which will be the big question, as it always is, what we're looking at, voter registration trends. Is one side or one demographic group trending up above and beyond previous cycles? Are they trending down? That was predictive of where we did well and where we didn't do well. We had good data in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Arizona, and Nevada. We didn't have good numbers on voter registration in New York and Florida and parts of California. Special elections, we're going to have those. God willing, we'll have one in New York 3. but we had, even the state legislative, we saw what happened in Virginia last night. Those special elections are helpful indicators of potential intensity and enthusiasm in those states, but also generally writ large. There's some things that we can then associate with other states. If it shows certain groups, younger voters, voters of color, older voters, whatever, seeing more intensity and enthusiasm. Fundraising numbers are incredibly helpful and impactful. Again, sort of writ large. That's the big picture data that we are looking at. Simon and I'm sure will be continuing to, as that data becomes available, sharing it and sharing our analysis, and we'd love to share that with this group. But those are some big sort of different other data elements beyond just the horse race polling that you can look at. Simon, what else?
So I just want to say that Winnie Freund has joined the chat, and I lived at Winnie's house in 1988 when I worked in Long Island for the Dukakis campaign. Winnie, it's great to see you. Her daughter was on the campaign, a wonderful. I miss her. It's been many years. But let me just, since we're going to be out of time soon, let me say a few things for you to think as you look ahead to 2024. Not every dollar is the same, right? There are places where dollars go further. And, I would have a bias towards spending money outside the presidential battlegrounds, because the presidential battlegrounds are going to be so heavily funded. I would choose House over Senate, right? Because the Senate, the machinery for raising money now in the Senate is just unbelievable. The amount of money our Senate candidates raise, and it's always harder to raise money, and a dollar goes a little bit further in the House races. I would also look at organizations that are doing turnout work in Hispanic and young people. Part of the challenge we have as Democrats is we have more voters. There are more of us than them, but we have more irregular and new voters. And so, accelerating the new and irregular voters into becoming regular voters is sort of a huge party-wide project that I don't think we've done enough collective work on. And I will say that somebody had raised the issue about Hispanics. We did much better with Hispanics. The Hispanic story is a little bit red wavy. There's a little bit, we actually, I have a whole presentation which you can go look at online, and I helped introduce bilingual polling to the Democratic Party and Spanish language advertising, is that the biggest the area of the country where we've made the biggest gains in the last 25 years has been in the Southwest. And Joe Biden won Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico. It was the first time we won those 4 states in the presidential election since 1940. We haven't controlled the 2 Senate seats, and I don't really know what Sinema's doing, but those, there hasn't been no Republican in the governorship and in the 2 Arizona Senate seats since 1951. The big gains we've made in the Southwest is the reason why we have a majority in the Senate. It's why we have a more cushy majority, presidential majority. So that's another place where we were told to feel bad about what we were doing, when in fact, what we've done with Hispanic voters may be the single biggest success story of the Democratic Party in the last 25 years. I'll give you just one other data point. In 2004, because of the population growth of Hispanics, our net margin with Hispanic voters nationally was 700,000 votes. In 2020, it was between 4.5 and 5.5 million votes, meaning that we've gained 4 million votes at least, and it may be as many as 5 million in our national vote total. Joe Biden won the election by 7 million votes, right? And so the Hispanic story is a story of success, progress, not a story of failure, right? Again, the MAGA thing is they want us to feel bad about what we do as opposed to feel good. And so I've really pushed back on the Hispanic thing, and we'll be releasing a major new piece on that in about 2 weeks.
Simon?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes.
This is Lenny Glynn. I just wanted to say hi. I haven't seen you since Little Rock, 1992.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm fine. In fact, I was active this cycle. I went to North Carolina, worked for Beasley. I just want to say to everybody on this call that Simon's presentation, things are better with Democrats, things get better.
Yeah.
That contains probably the most central message that you will remember, Simon. It's the economy's stupid, and don't forget healthcare. The
Dale, you're muted.
I would like to say a couple of things before we have to go. First of all, there was no way we could take all the questions. I'm going to save the chat and to some extent answer some of the questions. Plus, both Simon and Tom have very active Twitter presences if people want to follow them, and then they can ask these questions. So I just want to make sure people know about that. I wanted to just mention, and there's a lot of this was in the chat, but those of you who don't follow the chat, we have a few more, 3 more presentations that we're going to do that hit a lot of the same issues. So at the last week of January, the date's not set, we're going to see people from the Winning Jobs narrative. On February 8th, we're going to feature Anat Shenker-Osorio, who is a messaging guru, who I think you guys have dealt with. And she's going to share her research, and that should be fascinating. And then in very late February, we'll feature Michael Podhorzer, who is, one of the most highly respected political analysts. So we really have a date will be on our website, and we will obviously reach out to all of you. So as we go, I just want to ask us to unmute ourselves and give an incredible round of applause to Simon and Tom, who have left us feeling elevated and energized and ready to fight. And we will be raising money probably by March for 24. And I can't even tell you how happy I am to have had you. So if we can unmute, I don't know, Bill, if you can unmute.
Bravo.
Glass half full.
Amazing.
Dale, can I say one thing? Dale, can I say one last thing? I just want to say one last thing, because I'm doing many of these kinds of events over the next couple months. Tom and I are doing some together, some I'm doing on my own. And I just want to say one thing to all of you, right? Which is that part of what kept me going during the battle and the crap that was being poured in my head, and the old friends of mine over 30 years gone crazy, was all of you. Was the events like this that I was doing on a regular basis, where I could feel the passion, the patriotism, the love of country that I got in all these kinds of events like I'm getting tonight, and this sense of this incredible desire for a better tomorrow, for us to be strong, to fight and beat down MAGA and win this battle against MAGA. And I want all of you to know that you were my inspiration in this election. I mean, whatever inspiration Tom and I gave, you all gave it right back to us. And that one of the reasons I think the Democratic Party is so strong is because of all of you. And because regular citizens took it by the horns, didn't sit back, didn't become passive, right? Didn't obey in advance, as Timothy Snyder says, right? You guys showed in a very Tocquevillian, very American way that you're going to roll up your sleeves, go to work, and make a better country. And you were joined by millions of other people who did this. And all of you, this was an election that you won. You won this election. There was not a field general in this election, as there often is. This was a bottom-up victory of citizens, patriots who rolled up their sleeves and went to work. And so just keep at it, everybody. You made a huge difference, and the country needs you. And we can't give, we got to keep going through the 2024 cycle.